The boy was burning up. Clara Bennett could feel the heat coming off Evan's skin through the wool blanket she'd wrapped him in, a heat that had no business being in a child's body, a heat that scared her more than anything she'd ever faced in her 28 years of living. She pressed her lips to his forehead the way she'd done 100 times in the past 3 days and felt that same terrible warmth, and she kept walking because stopping was not something she could afford to do. The road, if it could even be called that, was little more than 2 wagon ruts carved into the earth by years of passing wheels. The red clay cracked and heaving in the autumn cold. The sky overhead had gone flat and pale, the kind of sky that meant nothing good. To her left, the grass ran out into scrub brush and then into nothing. To her right, a line of bare cottonwoods followed a dry creek bed, their white branches rattling softly in the wind. She had $6.40 in the pocket of her coat. She had half a loaf of bread in the satchel over her shoulder, the bread going stale, and a small tin of lard and a wool cap that had been her husband's that she'd jammed down over Evan's ears 2 days ago and hadn't removed since. She had a change of clothes for him, and almost nothing for herself. She had a letter from a woman named Dora Hutchins in the town of Caldwell, 40 miles south, a letter that was 4 months old and may or may not still represent a genuine offer of domestic work. That was what she had. What she did not have was Thomas. Thomas had been dead for 11 weeks. She still reached for him sometimes, in the half-second between sleep and waking, and then the awareness of where she was and what had happened to her life settled back down like a stone dropped in still water. He'd gone in 3 days. The fever took him fast, faster than it had taken the others, and by the time the doctor from Morrow County rode out to their homestead and looked at her husband's yellow skin and the red rash climbing his neck, there wasn't much left to discuss. The epidemic had moved through that part of the territory like fire through dry grass, town by town, farm by farm. And then it had come to their place, and it had taken Thomas and left her standing in the yard on a cold October morning with a 6-year-old boy and a farm she couldn't manage alone, and debts she'd had no idea existed until she started going through Thomas's papers. She'd sold the land in 3 weeks. Took the first offer because there was only one offer. The lawyer in town, a thin man named Ridley, who smelled of pipe tobacco and kept clearing his throat, had explained to her very patiently that the farm had been mortgaged twice over, and that after the debts were settled she would receive a remainder that was, in his words, modest. Modest had turned out to mean $42 and some change. Ridley had looked at her with something she recognized as pity, but had been careful not to name as such. She'd thanked him and walked out and stood on the boardwalk in front of his office for a long time, watching the wagons pass, trying to think. That had been 2 months ago. She'd spent most of those 2 months moving, boarding houses when she could afford them, barns when she couldn't, 2 nights in a church hall during a rainstorm when a deacon's wife had taken pity on her. She'd picked up work where she could find it, laundry, mending, helping a farm wife with canning. She'd answered 3 advertisements for domestic positions and had been turned down by all 3. Twice because the households weren't looking to take on a woman with a young child, and once because the rancher's wife had looked at Clara's dress and her boy's worn shoes and decided something unflattering without saying what. And then Evan had started coughing. At first she'd told herself it was the weather, the change in the air, the cold settling in. She'd told herself that and believed it for about 2 days before the cough turned wet and the fever climbed and he stopped eating. She tried to get him into a doctor in the town of Harlan's Cross, a decent-sized settlement she'd been moving through, but the doctor's office had a sign in the window that said the physician was out on a farm call and wouldn't be back until Thursday. It was Tuesday. She'd sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, Evan limp and heavy in her lap, until a woman came in and asked if they were patients, and when Clara explained the situation, the woman had looked at the boy and then at Clara and suggested gently but firmly that given the recent epidemic, it might be better if Clara didn't wait inside. She'd understood what that meant. She'd left Harlan's Cross before the afternoon was out. She'd asked 3 different people on the road south. If there was a doctor or a midwife or anyone who knew medicine within a day's walk, and 2 of them hadn't known, and one of them had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a ranch about 8 or 9 miles down the left fork of the road, a place called the Cole Ranch, and that the man who lived there had a reputation for keeping to himself, but that she might try there if she was truly desperate. Clara had been truly desperate since approximately October. She took the left fork. Well, She'd been walking for what she judged was close to 3 hours when she saw the smoke. It was thin and gray, rising from somewhere behind a low ridge of land that was covered in scrub oak and winter grass. She followed the road as it curved around the base of the ridge and came out on the other side, and there it was. A ranch house, low and solid, built from dark timber with a stone chimney from which the smoke rose. There was a barn behind it, larger than the house, and a corral with several horses standing at the fence looking at her approach. A windmill, a water tank, a cluster of outbuildings she couldn't identify at this distance. Evan stirred against her shoulder and made a small sound. His breathing was rough. She'd been tracking the quality of his breathing the way a navigator tracks stars. It was how she measured whether things were getting worse or simply bad. Right now, it was somewhere in the middle of those two possibilities, and she didn't want to think about what happened if it crossed to the former. She kept walking. The gate to the property was just two-seater posts with a wire latch. There was no sign, no name, nothing to indicate who lived here or whether they welcomed visitors. The horses at the corral watched her with calm, dark eyes. A dog somewhere behind the barn began to bark, then stopped. She pushed through the gate. She was maybe 30 yards from the house when the door opened. The man who came out was not what she'd expected, though she realized afterward that she hadn't known what she'd expected. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing dark canvas trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold. He had a dark beard, not carefully kept, and dark hair going gray at the temples. He looked to be somewhere past 40, but might have been younger, the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and something else, something less physical. He stood on the porch and watched her come up the path, and didn't say anything until she was close enough that it would have been strange not to. "You lost?" he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected and flat, not unfriendly, but not welcoming either. The voice of a man who'd stopped practicing pleasantries. "No," Clara said. "I was told you might be willing to help. My son is sick, and I've been walking for 3 days, and I don't have money for a doctor." She paused. "I was told there's no closer place." He looked at Evan. The boy was draped over her shoulder with his face turned toward the man, eyes half open and glazed. His breathing was audible even from 10 feet away. "Who told you to come here?" the man said. "A man on the road. I didn't get his name. He said the ranch belonged to a man named Cole." "That's me." He came down the 2 porch steps and stopped about 6 feet away and looked at the boy more carefully. Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't have said what exactly, but it was there. "How long has he been like this?" 4 days with the fever. The cough started before that." "The epidemic fever? From up north?" "No, at least I don't think so. My husband died of that. This is different. His chest." She swallowed. "He can't seem to draw a full breath." Cole stood there for a moment. He looked at her, then at the boy, then back at her. She could see him working something out behind his eyes, some calculation or negotiation with himself. "Come inside," he said finally. He didn't say it warmly. He said it like a man who'd made a decision and was committing to it before he could talk himself out of it. The inside of the house was plain and very clean, which surprised her. She'd expected disorder from a man living alone. But the kitchen was tidy, the floor swept, the dishes stacked neatly on a shelf beside the dry sink. A fire burned in the large stone fireplace at the end of the main room. There was a table with 2 chairs, a rocker near the fire, a sideboard with a lamp on it. The walls were bare except for one thing, a small drawing, a child's drawing by the look of it, tacked to the wood near the window. A house, and a tree, and 2 stick figures, one large and one small. She looked at it for only a second before she looked away. "Put him on the bed," Cole said, gesturing toward a door at the back of the room. "There's only the one." "I don't want to. I sleep in the barn half the time anyway." He was already moving, pulling a tin off the shelf, filling a pot with water from the bucket on the counter. "Go on." She carried Evan into the back room, which was a small bedroom with a single iron bed and a quilt that looked handmade. She laid him down carefully and tucked the quilt around him. He made a small, exhausted sound and turned his face to the side. His color was wrong, too flushed, the skin around his eyes and mouth looking waxy and thin. "Evan," she said quietly, "you're going to be all right." She didn't know if she believed it. She said it anyway because she didn't have anything else to say to him. She went back out to the main room. Cole was at the fire, and he had a small tin box on the table that he'd opened. He had the look of someone who knew what he was doing, which was more than she could say for herself right now. "I'm not a doctor," he said without looking up. "I know. I've dealt with chest illness before. Animals, mostly. Some people." He glanced up briefly. "What's his name?" "Evan. He's 6. He nodded, as if the name and age were data points he was filing away. "Yours?" "Clara Bennett." He didn't offer his in return, which she supposed was fair since she'd already been told it. He turned back to what he was doing. She watched him measure something from a brown bottle into a small cup. "Sit down," he said. "You look like you're about to fall down." She sat. She hadn't realized until that moment how much of herself she'd been holding together through sheer force of insistence. Sitting in the chair beside the fire, warmth finally reaching her hands and face, she felt the edges of everything she'd been carrying start to press through. Her eyes burned. She pressed her fingers against her eyelids and took 3 slow breaths. She did not cry. She didn't have the energy for it. Cole brought 2 things to the table, the small cup and a bowl of something that smelled like broth. He set the cup nearest her. "For the boy," he said. "Camphor and some other things. Goes on his chest, not in him. I'll show you." He showed her. She went to Evan and applied the mixture the way Cole described, and she could already hear the boy's breathing shift slightly in response. A small loosening. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't even close to a cure. But it was something, and something was what she'd been looking for 4 days. When she came back out, Cole had put the broth in front of the chair she'd been sitting in. "For you," he said. He was sitting at the other end of the table with a cup of coffee, not looking at her. "Thank you," she said. She meant it in a way that went deeper than the words could carry. He shrugged. "Just broth." She stayed up most of the night with Evan. Cole had given her the lamp and gone out to the barn, as he'd said he would, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the small back room and listened to her son breathe and watched the lamplight flicker across the ceiling and thought about the last several months of her life in the way you think about something when your mind is too tired to avoid it. She and Thomas had not been, well, they'd been fine. That was the honest way to say it. They'd been fine. They'd married when she was 23 and he was 28, a sensible match between 2 sensible people, and they'd worked their land and raised Evan and built something that wasn't unhappy. Thomas had been a quiet man, not given to much expression, but steady and responsible and mostly kind. She had loved him in the way you love something you've built your life around, which is a real kind of love, even if it's not the kind you read about. When he died, what she felt most, underneath the grief, was a kind of vertiginous terror, not just at the loss of him, but at the sudden understanding that she had no map for what came next. She'd made her own map. She was still making it. That was what these past months had been, the desperate cartography of a woman trying to find her way back to solid ground. Evan's fever broke around 3 in the morning. She felt it go, the sudden damp chill of his skin replacing the awful dry heat, and she pressed her palm to his forehead and held it there for a long moment before she let herself exhale. He stirred slightly. "Mama," he said, his voice small and hoarse. "I'm here," she said. "Go back to sleep." He did. His breathing was easier. She sat there until the lamp burned low, and then she put her head down on the edge of the bed next to his hand and slept for a few hours, the first real sleep she'd had in a week. In the morning, Garrett Cole found her asleep that way when he knocked at the back door and, getting no answer, pushed it open a few inches to check on the boy. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the woman with her head on the edge of his bed and the boy sleeping more normally now, not that terrible labored sleep of the night before. The woman's coat was still on, the satchel still over her shoulder where it had slid while she slept. Her hair, dark brown and plain, had come mostly loose from whatever she'd pinned it up with. There were lines of exhaustion on her face that a night's sleep hadn't touched. He pulled the door mostly closed and went back to the kitchen and put the coffee on. He wasn't a man given to extended reflection on his own motives. When he thought about why he'd told her to come inside, this stranger with her sick boy and her $6, he'd gathered it was something like that from the way she'd talked. He didn't arrive at anything particularly noble. He'd looked at the boy, at the sound coming from the boy's chest, and known that a child left without treatment in that condition might not make it through another night in the cold. That was all. He hadn't opened his door because he was a generous man. He'd opened it because he wasn't the kind of man who could close it. There was a difference, and he understood it even if he couldn't always articulate it. He'd lived alone on this ranch for 2 years and some months. Before that, he'd lived here with his wife, Sarah, and their son, James, who would have been 8 years old now. The epidemic, a different one, further east 4 years ago, had not discriminated between the worthy and the unworthy, between the people who deserved to be spared and the people who didn't. It had taken Sarah in a week and James 3 days after that, and Garrett had sat in this house alone for a long time afterward, sitting in the rocker by the fire and not particularly caring whether he got up again. He had gotten up again. That was the sum of his recovery, if you could call it that. He got up. He kept the ranch running, he kept the horses, sold some cattle, maintained the fence lines. He had a hired hand named Abe who came out 2 days a week and didn't talk much, which suited Garrett. He went to town when he had to and came back as soon as he could. He had made, without quite deciding to, a life that required very little of the parts of himself he no longer trusted to work properly. He was not, in other words, prepared for company. He poured a second cup of coffee when he heard movement in the back room, and when Clara appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, still wearing her coat, hair tucked back roughly behind her ears, he put the cup on the table without comment. She looked at it and then at him. "Sit," he said. She sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup. In the daylight, he could see how pale she was, and the set of her mouth, which was the set of someone who had been practicing not showing what they felt for quite some time. "His fever broke," she said. "Around 3, I think." "Good." He sat across from her with his own cup. "He'll need rest and more of that compound on his chest. 2, 3 more days, probably." She was quiet for a moment. "I can't pay you," she said. "Not what you'd deserve for this. I have some money, but not much." "I didn't ask for payment." "I know." She looked at him directly, which he noted. A lot of people, after a few minutes with him, stop doing that. "I'm not asking for charity either. If there's work I can do while we're here, I'll do it. Whatever you need. Cooking, cleaning, whatever wants doing." He looked at her for a moment. She meant it. That was clear enough. She wasn't negotiating. She was drawing the only line of dignity she had left and holding it. "Can you cook?" he said. "Well enough. Kitchen needs work. I eat mostly the same 4 things." "I can manage more than 4 things." Something close to a dry humor moved through his expression, gone almost before it arrived. "We'll see," he said. She cooked breakfast for the 3 of them, Cole going to the door of the back room and informing Evan in a matter-of-fact voice that there was food, if he was able. And while she cooked, she took in the kitchen more carefully than she'd been able to the night before. The house was in better shape than most single men's places she'd encountered. The basic structure was solid, the woodwork well-maintained, but there were things that wanted doing. A window with a broken latch, curtains that had faded to near translucence, a pantry whose organization she could already see needed work. She filed these things away without deciding anything. Evan appeared in the doorway, pale and hollow-eyed, but upright. He was wearing the wool cap, which was now several sizes too large for him, and sat crookedly above one ear. He looked at Cole with the frank, unself-conscious appraisal that 6-year-olds were capable of. Cole looked back at him. "You're big," Evan said. "Evan?" Clara said. "I'm just saying." "It's fine," Cole said. He was leaning against the wall near the fire, watching the boy with an expression that Clara couldn't quite read. "You hungry?" Evan nodded. "Then sit down." They ate. Cole ate fast and without conversation, the way a man eats who's used to eating alone and hasn't retrained himself. Evan ate slowly, picking at his food with the diminished appetite of someone still fighting illness, but he ate, which was more than he'd done for the past 2 days. Clara ate everything on her plate and felt slightly guilty about how good it tasted, eggs and salt pork and biscuits that were honestly better than what she'd have made, and realized it was the first full meal she'd had since before Harlan's Cross. "What do you need done first?" she said when the plates were cleared. Cole looked at her. "You don't have to start today." "I want to." He thought about it. "Window latch in the west wall's been broken since summer. Wood's warped. I've been meaning to get to it." "I can try the latch. I'll need tools." He showed her where the tools were, a proper cabinet of them in the barn, organized neatly, which told her something about him. She spent the morning working on the window latch while Cole went out to manage whatever it was that needed managing on a working cattle ranch in November, and Evan sat wrapped in the quilt in the rocker by the fire and slept on and off and watched her work when he was awake. "Is that man going to let us stay?" Evan asked at one point, his voice still raspy. "For a little while," Clara said, "while you get better." "He's not mean," Evan said, as if this required commentary. "He seems mean, but he's not." "Evan, I'm just saying." He pulled the quilt tighter around himself. "He gave me extra biscuit, and he thought I was asleep." Clara paused, chisel in hand, and looked at her son. "Did he?" "He put it on the plate real quiet, like he didn't want anyone to see." She turned back to the window and said nothing, but she filed it away, next to the drawing on the wall, next to the way his face had changed when he'd looked at Evan the night before, next to the second cup of coffee, placed without comment or explanation. 3 days turned into a week. The week turned into 2. She wasn't sure exactly when it stopped being a temporary arrangement and started being something with less clear edges. There was no single conversation, no negotiation. Cole simply continued to not tell her to leave, and she continued to work, and Evan continued to recover. And one morning she went to start breakfast and found Cole had already lit the fire and had the coffee on, and it didn't feel strange, which was the thing she noticed, that it didn't feel strange. Evan, for his part, had attached himself to Cole with the direct, uncomplicated affection of a child who needed something to hold on to. He followed the man around when he was allowed to, asking questions in the persistent, methodical way of children who genuinely want to understand things, and Cole, this surprised her, answered them. Not with excessive warmth, not in the way of a man performing fatherliness, but in the way of someone who took questions seriously. He showed the boy how the windmill worked. He explained the difference between the horse breeds in the corral. He spent 20 minutes one afternoon demonstrating how to properly coil a rope, correcting Evan's grip 3 times until the boy got it right, and then said, "There," with a blunt satisfaction that made Evan beam like he'd been handed a prize. She watched this from a distance, these small exchanges, and felt something she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. She'd fixed the window latch on the 3rd day. After that, she'd reorganized the pantry, worked through the laundry that had been accumulating in the back room, repaired a tear in the curtains with thread she'd found in a basket on the sideboard, and made her way through enough cleaning that the house had a different quality to it when you walked in. Not cleaner exactly, Cole kept things clean, but more inhabited, in the way a space feels when someone has actually lived in it with attention. Cole had said nothing about any of this. He ate what she cooked, which was more varied than his previous 4 things, and he paid her. When she'd discovered he'd left coins on the kitchen table one morning and argued with him about it, he'd said flatly that he'd said he needed work done, and he intended to pay for it. She'd stopped arguing. She was writing to Dora Hutchins in Caldwell, explaining that she'd been delayed. She didn't know exactly what she was delaying toward or away from. She told herself she was staying until Evan was fully recovered, until the weather improved, until she had a clear sense of where she was going. These were all true reasons. She wasn't sure they were the only reasons. The trouble started on a Tuesday, which was when Abe came by. Abe was Cole's hired hand, a lean, weather-beaten man of about 50 who arrived with his mule on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and departed before noon. He looked at Clara the first time he saw her in the kitchen with a particular expression, not hostile but speculative, the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic. He was polite. He said good morning and thank you when she poured him coffee and didn't push for information. But she knew the expression. She'd been seeing versions of it her whole life, the expression of someone calculating what a woman's presence in a man's house signified and whether it was the kind of thing that bore discussion. She knew it would travel. That was the nature of things. Abe would mention it to someone, not maliciously, maybe, and that someone would mention it to another, and by the time the information reached the nearest town, which was a place called Millhaven, some 7 miles east, it would have accumulated the usual distortions. She raised it with Cole on a Wednesday evening when Evan was asleep. She'd been trying to decide whether to for several days and concluded it was the kind of thing that wanted saying. "Abe will have mentioned me," she said. They were sitting at opposite ends of the table. Cole was going through some papers, ranch accounts or something of that nature, and she had her hands around her coffee cup. "In town." Cole looked up. "I'm a widow living in your house," she said, unaccompanied. People will draw their own conclusions. People can think what they want, Cole said. He said it without heat, as if this genuinely did not concern him. I know, but I care about what it means for Evan. She set down her cup. If I'm looking for work, proper work, a household position, it matters what people say about me. Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked back down at his papers, then up again. I hadn't thought about that, he said, and she believed him. He was not a man who spent much time thinking about what other people thought. I'm not asking you to do anything, she said. I just wanted you to know I was thinking about it. He nodded. All right. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in it. She didn't know what. Something considering. Do you have somewhere to go? A firm offer. Not firm. The letter in Caldwell is 4 months old. She paused. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. He nodded again as if this were a satisfactory answer and went back to his papers. She sat there a little longer, warming her hands on the cup, listening to the wind work at the corners of the house. The letter arrived on the last Friday of November, delivered by a rider from Millhaven who'd been asked to bring out whatever accumulated mail was at the post office. Clara didn't know anyone was writing to her. The only person who knew where she was, beyond the people in Harlan's Cross who might have noted her direction, was the woman in Caldwell, and she hadn't expected a response to her own letter that quickly. She stood in the kitchen with the envelope in her hands and felt an unspecific dread before she'd even opened it, the kind of dread you feel when you recognize someone's handwriting and remember what that someone represents in your life. The handwriting was Marcus Bennett's. She'd known Thomas's cousin existed the way you know about things that don't directly concern you, abstractly and without much detail. Marcus was from the eastern branch of the family, from money that Thomas's side of the family had never quite reached. He'd appeared twice in her marriage, once at the wedding, brief and impeccably dressed, with the manner of a man doing a social obligation, and once about a year later when he'd ridden through the area on business and had dinner with them. He'd been perfectly pleasant. He'd also spent most of the dinner looking at Evan with an interest that Clara had noticed and filed away under the category of things she didn't know what to do with. She opened the letter. Marcus expressed condolences for Thomas's death, which he'd apparently only recently heard about. He expressed concern for her welfare. He expressed, and this was where the language became more careful, more legal, an interest in Evan's future, noting that as the surviving male relative of the Bennett family, he felt a responsibility toward the boy. He wrote that he would be passing through the territory in the coming month and hoped to call on her. He wrote that he wanted to discuss arrangements for Evan's future that he believed would be to everyone's benefit. Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went outside and stood in the cold for a while, looking at the flat winter sky. She was still standing there when Cole came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her. What happened? He said. She handed him the letter. She wasn't sure why. She hadn't made a decision to. She simply handed it to him, and he took it and read it, and she watched his face while he did. His face did not change much, but there was a stillness that came over him, the kind of stillness that is the opposite of blankness, the stillness of someone who has understood something and is deciding what to do with that understanding. He handed it back to her. What do you know about him? Cole said. Not much. He's wealthy. He was always polite. She paused. He looked at Evan in a way I didn't like. What kind of way? She tried to find the words for it. Like he was calculating something, not like he was fond of him, like he was assessing him. Cole was quiet. I don't know what he wants, she said. The letter says his interest is Evan's welfare, but the letter also says he's coming whether I write back or not. Do you have any legal standing? Cole said. It was a practical question asked without softness. He's my son. I'm his mother. That's not always enough, Cole said. He said it without cruelty, which made it worse. She knew he was right. She knew it because she'd spent the past several years in a part of the world where what a woman could and couldn't claim in a court of law was often a very different thing from what she should be able to claim, and where a wealthy man with lawyers and patience could make a legal case out of almost anything if he decided to make one. He could argue I'm unfit, she said. It was the first time she'd let herself say it plainly. Widow, no property, no fixed address, living in a man's house without... She stopped. Cole looked at her. The wind moved through the yard, rattling the gate she hadn't latched properly that morning. Yes, Cole said very quietly, not as if he was agreeing with Marcus, as if he was finishing her sentence and knowing what came next. It would be better, she said, and stopped again. Say it, Cole said. She met his eyes. They were dark brown and level and had in them the same quality she'd noticed from the first night, the quality of a man who'd been through enough that he didn't have the patience anymore for things that weren't true. It would be better, she said, if I weren't alone. Garrett Cole stood in the cold yard of his ranch and looked at this woman he'd known for 3 weeks and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Come inside. It's cold." She followed him in. He poured coffee without being asked. He set both cups on the table. He sat down. She sat across from him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and somewhere in the back of the house, Evan was asleep, breathing easily now, fully on the mend. And outside, the wind pushed at the walls of the house that 2 people had built, and one person had been holding together alone, and the lamp on the sideboard sent a warm, unsteady light across the table between them. "I'm not going to pretend this is something it isn't," Cole said finally. "I know what you're talking about, and I know why you're talking about it." "I'm not asking you for anything," Clara said quickly. "I know you're not." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "But you didn't have to say it. The fact that you said it means you've already thought about it enough to say it." She didn't answer that. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. It was the first time he'd mentioned it. He said it the way you say something that has passed the point of being painful, past the active wound, into the residual tenderness. "My son, too." "I know," she said. "The drawing on the wall." He looked at her. "You saw it." "That first night." He nodded. He looked down at the coffee. "I'm not looking for what I had," he said. "I don't think I could do that. I'm not sure I'd want to, even if I could." He looked up. "But you're not asking for that." "No," she said. "I'm not." "You're asking for something different. Something—" He stopped, started again. "Something that might become real, if we were honest about it." The word hung between them, real. Clara felt something shift inside her, something that was not hope, exactly. Hope was too light a word for what she'd been carrying, but something adjacent to it. Something that had to do with the recognition of 2 people who had both stopped pretending that the shape of a life could be determined in advance, who had learned instead to make decisions in the terrain they were actually standing in, not the terrain they'd imagined they'd be standing in by now. "I don't know what it would become," she said carefully. "I'm not going to say I do, but I think—" She paused. "I think we're both honest enough to try." Cole looked at her for a long moment. His face was not easy to read, but there was something in it, something that had been closed for a long time and was not quite open, but was considering the possibility of opening. "All right," he said. 2 words. The same ones he'd said that first night, when she'd appeared at his gate with a burning child in her arms and nothing left to lose. She'd recognized then that they were not a generous offer. They were a commitment, reluctant perhaps, and careful, and not at all certain, but real. She thought they might be that again. Outside, the wind had quieted. The fire settled in the hearth. In the back room, Evan slept without coughing for the first time in 2 weeks, and the lamplight held steady, and the cold was something that existed outside, on the other side of solid walls where it could not reach them. They didn't talk about it again that night, and they didn't talk about it the next morning either. There was something unspoken between them, the way there is between 2 people who have acknowledged something significant and then quietly stepped back from it to let it settle before anyone tries to pick it up and examine it in the light. Clara made breakfast. Cole went out to check on the horses. Evan ate his eggs and asked if he could go outside, and Clara told him he could if he stayed near the porch, and he did mostly for about 20 minutes before she looked out the window and saw him standing at the corral fence with his arms through the rails, talking to the gray mare with tremendous seriousness. She left him there. He needed air and he needed to feel like himself again. Cole had come back from the barn by then and was standing nearby, not intervening, just there. Present in the way he was present, which was without announcement or performance. She watched him watch the boy and then turned back to the dishes. By the end of that week, the arrangement had been spoken aloud, briefly, practically, in the way of 2 people determined not to make it more than it needed to be. Cole had ridden into Millhaven on Friday morning and returned in the early afternoon. He'd set his hat on the peg by the door, poured himself coffee, and stood at the counter. "I spoke to Judge Alderman," he said. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. "He's a circuit judge. He was in town. He told me what we'd need." Cole looked at his coffee. 2 witnesses. A signed statement of intent. He can perform it himself when he comes back through in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, she said. That's when he'll be back this way. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the pale sky beyond it. His jaw was set in the way it set when he'd made a decision and was done questioning it. "All right," she said. Cole nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when she'd shown him the letter. No ceremony, no fuss, just the acknowledgement that the next thing was going to happen. "I'll write to Marcus," she said. "I'll tell him I've remarried. That would be better coming before he arrives." "I know." She wrote the letter that afternoon sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close because the day had gone gray and heavy. It was a difficult letter to write, not because she didn't know what to say, but because every word she chose had to thread the needle between firmness and the kind of tone that wouldn't give Marcus any additional ammunition. She wrote that she was well, that Evan was well, that she had in fact recently married and was settled. She did not apologize. She did not invite correspondence. She told him she hoped his journey west was comfortable and signed it with her name, which would shortly be different. She sealed it and gave it to Cole to take to the post in the morning without reading it back to herself. She'd learned in the past few months that reading things back to yourself was a way of losing your nerve. The 2 weeks before the judge returned were ordinary, which was itself its own strange quality. She'd stopped thinking of the ranch as a temporary shelter and had started thinking of it as a place she was responsible for, which was a different relationship to have with a piece of land and a set of walls. She noticed things differently. The way the afternoon light came through the east window in a long stripe that moved across the floor as the day progressed. The way the barn smelled in the morning when she carried out table scraps. The particular sound the gate made when the wind came from the north. Small things. The things you only learn about a place when you've been in it long enough to stop being a guest. Cole, for his part, had made no adjustment to his habits that she could see. Except for one thing, which she didn't notice for about 3 days, and then noticed and couldn't unnotice. He talked more. Not much more. Not in any way that would have registered to someone who didn't know him. But whereas before he'd answered questions in the shortest possible form and offered nothing unprompted, he now occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, offered something on his own. He told her, unbidden, that the gray mare had a tendency to colic if she got into the wrong hay. He told her the name of the man in Millhaven who kept an honest scale at the feed store and the name of the man who did not. He told her once, over supper, that the winter before last had been the worst he could remember, that the snow had come in October and not left until April, and that he'd lost 4 head of cattle and nearly a horse. He said it without obvious purpose. She suspected he'd said it because he was learning, against his inclinations, to fill silence with something other than more silence. Evan, meanwhile, was fully recovered and entirely unaware of the significance of what was happening around him. He understood that they were staying. He understood that Mr. Cole, as he called him, was going to be something more than a man who let them use his house. He accepted this with the flexibility of a 6-year-old who had already survived more disruption in the past year than most children see in a decade. He asked, once, whether he was going to have to call Mr. Cole something different. "You don't have to call him anything different," Clara said. "What do you call a man who's married to your mother?" "Some children call him father," Clara said carefully. "But you can figure that out when it feels right. There's no rule." Evan thought about this with his particular thoughtful frown. "What does Mr. Cole want me to call him?" "You could ask him." So he did. Clara was in the barn the next afternoon when she heard the conversation happening in the corral, Evan's high, thin voice and Cole's low one, and she stayed where she was and listened. "What should I call you?" Evan said. "After." A pause. "What do you want to call me?" "I don't know. I called my dad Papa, but you're not my dad." "No," Cole said. "I'm not." "You're something else, though." "Something else," Cole agreed. Another pause. "Garrett," Evan said, testing the word. "That's my name." "Is that okay?" The silence was a few seconds longer this time. "That's okay," Cole said. Clara did not announce to anyone that she'd heard this. She finished in the barn and came back to the house and started supper. And when Cole came in later, she didn't say anything about it, and neither did he. And that was fine. Some things didn't need commentary to be real. The marriage itself happened on a Thursday morning, 10 days into December, when the judge came through on his circuit and Cole had arranged for Abe and a woman named Martha Frey, a farmer's wife from 2 miles east who had been bringing eggs by every week and who had not asked questions, which Claire had come to understand was the frontier equivalent of significant social goodwill, to serve as witnesses. The judge was a compact, gray-haired man named Alderman, who conducted the proceeding in the kitchen with the same brisk manner he probably brought to other official business. The ceremony was short. Cole stood in his good shirt. She'd washed it the day before without mentioning why, and he'd put it on without mentioning why. And Clara stood next to him in the least worn dress she owned, which wasn't saying much, and Evan stood slightly behind and to the left of them, watching with intense concentration. When the judge asked if they took each other, they both said they did. Their voices were steady. Clara noticed this afterward, that neither of them had wavered, and she wasn't sure what it meant about them except perhaps that they were both people who committed to things they decided to do. The judge signed the paper. Abe signed it. Martha signed it, pressed Clara's hand briefly and warmly, and said she was glad. They had coffee. The judge left to continue his circuit. Abe went back to whatever Abe had been doing. Martha stayed a few minutes longer. She was a broad, practical woman who moved through the world with the efficiency of someone who'd never had time to waste on the inessential. She refilled her own coffee without being asked. "Town's going to talk," she said, not unkindly. "I know," Clara said. "People here have been watching Garrett's land for 2 years. There are 2 or 3 families who had ideas about it." She set down her cup. "They'll say things. I want you to be prepared." "What kinds of things?" Martha looked at her steadily. "That you came here on purpose, that you planned it, that you're after the land." She paused. "That you're not what a decent woman ought to be." Clara held her gaze. "And what will you say?" Martha picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "I'll say I've seen the way you've kept this house and raised that boy, and that's enough for me." She pulled the coat on. "I'll say that in whatever company sees fit to discuss it." After she left, the house was quiet. Cole was back outside. Evan had disappeared toward the barn. Clara stood in the kitchen with the signed paper on the table in front of her and looked at it for a moment. Clara Cole, she thought. The name sat in her mind with a strange weight that was neither good nor bad. It was just new, and new things took time to become familiar. She folded the paper carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, next to Marcus's letter. The gossip arrived before Marcus did, which was almost predictable. It came in the form of a woman named Vera Hollis, the wife of a merchant in Millhaven, who appeared at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with a covered dish and the expression of someone delivering goodwill that was mostly reconnaissance. Clara recognized the type immediately and let her in without hesitation, because the worst thing you could do with that particular kind of interest was refuse it. Vera was perhaps 50, dressed carefully, with quick eyes and the habit of phrasing observations as questions. She admired the kitchen. She asked how Clara had settled in. She asked how long Clara had known Garrett before their marriage, and Clara said simply that they'd known each other and found common ground, which was true, and told nothing. She poured Vera coffee and sat with her and answered what could be answered and deflected what couldn't, and when Vera left, she had Clara judged, given the woman nothing worse to carry away than the impression of a composed, competent woman who was not easily rattled. She told Cole about the visit over supper. He listened. He ate. He said, "Vera Hollis's husband was one of the people who made an offer on this land after, he stopped. "After Sarah and James, I turned it down. So she has reasons to be interested in you that aren't just social. Most things people do have reasons underneath them." He forked a piece of potato. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing useful." He looked at her then, briefly, with something that she was beginning to recognize as his version of approval. Not warm, but specific. Like he was noting a quality he hadn't been certain of and was now more certain of. "Good," he said. Evan, who had been eating with the focus of a child who pretended not to be listening to adult conversation, said, "She brought a pie, though. The pie was good." "The pie was good," Clara agreed. Cole's mouth did the thing it sometimes did at the corners, barely. "What kind?" Apple, Evan said. The crust was better than yours, Mama. Thank you, Evan. I'm just saying. Good. Marcus arrived on the 15th of December. She'd known he was coming because Abe, who went into Millhaven on Tuesdays, had mentioned seeing a well-dressed Eastern man at the hotel asking after a widow named Bennett. The name had already changed, which was precisely the point, and Clara had asked Abe to say nothing further if asked. And Abe, being Abe, had said he didn't make a habit of talking about other people's business. Marcus arrived at the gate on a gray horse with a carpet bag behind the saddle, wearing a dark wool coat that cost more than everything in Clara's satchel combined. He was perhaps 45, lean and fair-haired, going to gray at the edges, with the particular bearing of a man accustomed to being the best-dressed person in any given room. He'd looked like that at the wedding too, years ago. He looked the same now, just more deliberate, the way people become when they've decided something. Cole was in the yard when he arrived, and Clara was at the window, and she watched the two men approach each other with the careful attention of someone watching a river and trying to judge the current. "I'm looking for Clara Bennett," Marcus said from the gate. "No one by that name here," Cole said. His voice was flat. He didn't move toward the gate. Marcus looked at him. Something shifted in the calculation behind his eyes. "Then perhaps I have the wrong ranch. I was told—" "You're looking for my wife," Cole said. "Her name is Clara Cole. You can come in, or you can go back to town. Up to you." A long pause. Marcus came in. Clara had moved to the porch by the time he reached the house. She watched him take in Cole, who was standing near the fence post with no particular expression, and then take in her, and then the house. And she could see him adjusting something in whatever plan he'd arrived with. "Clara," Marcus said. He smiled. It was a practice smile, one of those smiles that was designed to seem genuine. "You look well." "Thank you," she said, coming out of the cold. He came in. He took off his hat. He looked at the kitchen with the assessing glance of a man who was adding up the details of other people's lives and measuring them against some internal standard. She didn't offer him coffee right away, which was deliberate. There was a kind of small power in making someone wait for the hospitality you were going to give them anyway. Cole came in behind him and stood at the edge of the room. He didn't sit. That was deliberate too, Clara thought. Not hostile exactly, but not deferential. The body language of a man on his own property. "I was under the impression," Marcus said, "that you were unattached." "I wrote to you," Clara said, "nearly 3 weeks ago." "I was already traveling when the letter arrived. I received it late." He looked at Cole, then back at her. "How long have you been married?" "Long enough," Cole said from across the room. Marcus's eyes moved to him again, a little slower this time, calculating. "I see." "Marcus," Clara said, drawing his attention back, "what was it you wanted to discuss about Evan?" He turned the smile on again. "Only his welfare. As the surviving, Evan is well," she said. "He's happy. He's been ill, but he's recovered. He's settled here." "I'm glad to hear it." He paused. "I had thought, given your circumstances, that perhaps it would be in the boy's interest to—" "His circumstances have changed," Cole said. "That's why we're telling you." Another pause. Longer. Marcus looked at Cole with the full attention that he'd been parceling out carefully until now. And Cole looked back, and there was something in that exchange that Clara couldn't entirely follow, the way men sometimes communicate in a register that has nothing to do with the words they're saying. "Of course," Marcus said finally. He looked back at Clara. His voice had shifted, not hostile, but less performatively warm, more careful. "Then I suppose congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Clara said. He stayed for perhaps another 20 minutes. He drank the coffee she offered, asked a few polite questions about the ranch, said that Evan seemed like a fine boy when Evan appeared briefly in the doorway and looked at him with frank suspicion before disappearing again. He said he was glad Clara was settled. He said it with the specific neutrality of someone who had come to do something and found the thing already done, and was deciding in real time how to respond to that. When he left, Clara stood at the window and watched him ride back down the road toward Millhaven until he was gone from sight. "He's not finished," Cole said behind her. "No," she said. "He's not." She'd known it from the moment she'd seen his eyes adjust when she said her name was Cole now. He'd recalibrated. Whatever he'd planned to do, Finding her remarried had made it more complicated, but not impossible, and she'd seen him understand that in the set of his jaw beneath the careful smile. She turned away from the window. "He'll look into it," she said. "He'll find out how long we've been married. He'll talk to people in town." "Let him," Cole said. "It might not be enough, Garrett." She said his name and noticed that she'd been doing that more, using it rather than avoiding it. The timing of the marriage. People like Marcus can turn timing into motive when they want to. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. Not at the question, but at the man asking it. This closed, careful, unexpectedly steady man who had opened his door when he didn't have to, and who had stood at a gate and said "my wife" without flinching. "I want to be ready," she said. "Whatever he tries, I want to be ready." Cole nodded. "Then we will be." Outside, the sky had gone the particular deep gray of coming snow. Evan was at the barn door, peeking out at the empty road, and then he turned and came back toward the house at a trot, his breath making small white clouds in the cold air. He pushed through the door and looked at his mother, and then at Cole. "Is that man coming back?" he said. "Maybe," Clara said. Evan considered this with his serious 6-year-old gravity. "I don't like him," he said. "He looked at me like I was something he was going to buy." Neither Cole nor Clara said anything to that. There wasn't anything to say because the boy had seen it exactly right. The first snow came that night, soft and steady, covering the road and the yard and the roof of the barn. And in the morning, the ranch looked like something smoothed clean, a white-over of all its ordinary roughness. And Clara stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at it and felt something she didn't name right away. Something that had to do with the fact that she'd made a decision and was still standing, and that the house was warm, and that her son was asleep in the next room, and that the man she'd married was somewhere outside doing the things that needed doing. It wasn't contentment. It was too early for that, and she was too careful a person to call it that. But it was something close to steadiness, the sense of ground underfoot where there had been none. That was enough. For now. That was more than enough. January came in hard. The snow that had fallen soft and quiet on the night of Marcus's visit had been only the beginning. By the first week of the new year, the road to Millhaven was buried past the wheel hubs, and the temperature at night dropped low enough that the water in the kitchen bucket had a thin skin of ice on it by morning. Cole banked the fires before he went to sleep and checked them first thing before dawn. And Clara had started keeping a kettle near the hearth all day, so there was always something warm within reach. It was the kind of cold that simplified things. When survival required a certain level of daily attention, wood to split, animals to feed, pipes to keep from freezing, there wasn't much mental space left over for the larger anxieties. Clara found this almost a relief. She'd spent too many weeks inside her own head, turning the situation with Marcus over and looking at it from all its angles. And the plain physical demands of a ranch in deep winter gave her somewhere else to put her attention. Marcus had not returned. He had not written. This was not the same thing as him being finished, and she knew it, but his silence had a different quality than she'd expected. Less like retreat, and more like someone taking time to arrange their position. She thought about it sometimes, late at night when the house had gone quiet and the fire was burning low. She thought about what he'd looked at when he'd sat in this kitchen, the signed marriage certificate she hadn't shown him, but which he'd know existed. The boy, the ranch, the man she'd married. She thought about what he'd been calculating behind that careful smile. She didn't talk about it with Cole every day. There was a way in which talking about it too much would have worn grooves in both of them, and she was practical enough to know that. They'd established, without discussing it, a kind of shared watchfulness. The way two people who live in the same house in an uncertain situation develop a shared peripheral vision for things that might be coming. What she hadn't expected was how much else there would be to notice. Cole woke up with nightmares. She'd known it for a while before she acknowledged knowing it, the way you know things that are inconvenient to know. The walls between rooms in the ranch house were solid enough but not thick enough to entirely swallow sound, and twice in the first weeks she'd heard him, not crying out exactly, more a sudden rough waking, the sound of a man who'd surfaced fast from somewhere he didn't want to be. And then silence, and then after a while, the quiet sounds of a man moving around a kitchen in the dark, and the small percussion of a coffee cup being set on a table. She never mentioned it, but one night in early January, she woke to those sounds and then couldn't go back to sleep. and she lay in the dark listening to the house and thinking about the drawing on the wall in the main room. A house and a tree and two stick figures, one large and one small. She'd never asked about it directly. She knew what it was, of course. She knew who'd drawn it. She got up. She put on her coat and went out to the main room. Cole was sitting in the chair by the dead fire with a cup in his hands, not drinking it. He looked up when she appeared without surprise, as if he'd heard her wake up. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be." She sat in the other chair, the rocker, which had been hers by default now for weeks, and pulled her coat tighter. The room was cold without the fire. She didn't ask him to light it. "You don't have to keep it to yourself," she said. "Whatever it is." Cole looked at the cup. "It's not something that can be talked through." "I know." "Then what are you offering?" She thought about it honestly. "Company," she said. "That's all." He looked at her. The dark was thin enough that she could see his face, the lines of it, the way exhaustion and old grief sat differently on a person than ordinary tiredness. She knew what that looked like because she'd seen it in the mirror. He didn't say anything for a while. The house settled around them, the particular sounds of timber and cold, small creaks and shifts, the house adjusting to itself. "James used to have nightmares," he said finally. "He'd come find me. He'd just stand in the doorway until I woke up." A pause. "He never needed me to do anything. He just needed to know I was there." Clara didn't say anything. She understood that this was not the beginning of a conversation. It was the whole of what he was willing to offer, and it was more than he'd offered before, and she treated it accordingly. "Evan does that too," she said eventually. "Stands in the doorway." "I know. I've seen him." "Has he come to you?" Cole looked at the cup again. "Once. About 2 weeks ago. I was up already." He set the cup down on the floor near his foot. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a while and then went back to bed. Clara was quiet. She felt something in her chest that was too complex to name quickly. Something that had to do with her son finding his way toward this man in the dark, and this man sitting still and letting himself be found. "You didn't tell me," she said. "It didn't seem like mine to tell." He looked at her. "It was between him and me." That was, she thought, exactly the right thing to say, which was not something she'd expected from him, even now, even after everything. She stayed in the chair until the cold got too sharp, and then went back to bed, and in the morning nobody mentioned it, and that was right too. It was Martha Frey who told her about the talk in town. Martha came on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January, navigating the cleared path from the road on her big, steady farm horse, carrying a basket and the look of a woman with something to say. Clara had the coffee on before Martha was through the door. "Sit," Clara said. Martha sat. She took off her mittens and held the coffee cup the way people hold hot things in winter, with both hands in genuine appreciation. She didn't open with it immediately, which meant it was something she'd been turning over on the ride out. "Vera Hollis has been talking," Martha said. Clara poured her own cup and sat across from her. "What has she been saying?" "That you came here on purpose. That you'd heard Garrett had land and no wife, and you found a way to get yourself through his door." Martha looked at her steadily. "She's saying the marriage was arranged to get around a custody matter, that it's not real." "What does not real mean to Vera Hollis?" "It means what it sounds like." Martha paused. "She's been saying you and Garrett aren't, that you have an arrangement of convenience, not a proper marriage." Clara held the cup. She looked at the table. The word arrangement sat between them with uncomfortable accuracy, and she was aware, for the first time in a while, of the distance between what was true and what was entirely true. "Who else is saying it?" she said. "Frank Dillard's wife, some others." Martha set down her cup. "Clara, the man who's been asking around about you, the Eastern man, the one who came here, Marcus Bennett. He's still in Millhaven. He hasn't left." Clara looked up. "He's been at the hotel for 3 weeks, Martha said. "He had a meeting with a man named Holt 2 weeks ago. Holt's a land attorney out of the county seat." The information settled into Clara's understanding with the specific weight of something she'd been bracing for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Not custody, then. Or not only custody. Something with the land in it, too. She stood up and went to the door of the barn passage and called for Cole. He came in still wearing his work coat, stamping snow off his boots, reading her face before he'd even fully stepped inside. She told him what Martha had said. She watched him go still in that particular way he had. Not shock exactly, more like a closing in, a man pulling his perimeter tight. He looked at Martha. Holt? That's the name I heard. He's filed suits before, Cole said. Nothing to do with custody. He works property claims. What does Marcus want with a property attorney? Claire said. Cole looked at her. He wants the ranch. Came out flat and certain. Not a guess. Evan has inheritance rights, Cole said. From Thomas. Which means anything Thomas stood to inherit from the family line passes to Evan, held in trust until he comes of age. If Marcus can establish himself as Evan's guardian, he controls that trust. There's no inheritance, Clara said. Thomas had nothing when he died. We sold the farm to pay debts. Marcus may know something you don't, Cole said, or he may be creating a legal pretext that has nothing to do with what's actually in the estate. Something that looks like a custody case, but is really a land claim through the boy. Martha, who had been listening without interrupting, said quietly, Then it's not just about Evan. No, Cole said, it never was. Clara thought about the look on Marcus's face when he'd sat in this kitchen. The way his eyes had moved around the room, taking in the house, the land through the window, the child who stood to inherit from a family line that connected to property somewhere that Marcus understood better than she did. She thought about the way he'd adjusted when he found her remarried, not retreating but recalibrating, and she understood now what the recalibration had been for. He's going to file something, she said. Probably, Cole said. We need a lawyer. I know. He pulled off his work coat and hung it. There's a man in Calder, 2 towns east, Dan Prescott. He's handled property disputes before and he's honest. Can we afford him? The question was direct and she'd asked it directly because this was the kind of thing that wanted plain speaking between them. Cole looked at her with that level look. I'll manage it, he said. She rode with Cole to Calder on a Thursday when the road had cleared enough for the wagon. Evan stayed with Martha, who had offered without being asked, which was the kind of person Martha was. Dan Prescott's office was above a dry goods store, a small, warm room crowded with papers and smelling of leather and ink. Prescott himself was a compact man of perhaps 55 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the manner of someone who listened before he spoke and meant what he said when he did. He heard everything they laid out. The letter from Marcus, the visit, Martha's information about Holt, the timing of the marriage, the question of any Bennett family inheritance, and he asked questions that were specific and pointed and wrote things down in a small leather notebook. When they'd finished, he sat back. The custody argument is weak if the marriage is solid, he said. A sitting judge in a domestic matter is going to look at the child's situation first. Evan is healthy, settled, with a mother and a stepfather and a stable home. That's a strong position. Marcus will challenge the marriage, Clara said. He'll argue timing. He can argue it. Timing is an illegality. People marry quickly on the frontier for all kinds of reasons. Prescott looked at her over his spectacles. The question is whether your marriage presents as genuine to a judge. There was a beat of silence. Clara felt Cole shift slightly beside her, not away from her, not toward her, just a small adjustment, a recognition that the question had landed. What does genuine look like in court? Cole said. Shared life, common household, evidence of mutual investment in the property, in the child, witnesses who can speak to the relationship's character. Prescott tapped his pen on the notebook. People who've observed you together. Martha Frey? Clara said. Abe Warren. Good. Anyone from Millhaven who isn't already aligned with the gossip. Judge Alderman performed the ceremony, Cole said. Prescott looked up at that. You had a circuit judge perform it? He came through. It was the practical option. That's useful. Alderman is well regarded. Prescott made a note. What about the property claim? If Marcus is using Holt, he's going to argue some form of inheritance right through the boy. What do you know about the Bennett family assets? Nothing beyond what Thomas told me, Claire said. He didn't discuss his family much. He said they were Eastern, that there had been money generations back that had come down considerably. I'll have to do some research on the Bennett line, Prescott said. If there's a legitimate inheritance that changes the complexity of this. If Marcus is fabricating one, that's a different problem, but also an easier one to defeat. He looked at them both. Either way, this is going to hearing. You should prepare for that. On the ride home, they didn't talk much. The road ran through bare-branched oak and cottonwood, the sky a pale winter blue, the light thin and cold. The horses moved at a steady pace. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the road ahead. He said the marriage needs to present as genuine, she said at some point. She said it to the road rather than to Cole. I heard him. What does that mean to you? Cole took a moment. He wasn't a man who filled pauses carelessly. It means we need to be what we already are, he said, more visibly. She looked at him. We share a house, he said. We share the work of this place. We're raising that boy together, whether or not either of us set out to do that. He kept his eyes on the road. That's not nothing. Prescott said genuine. I think that's genuine enough. She thought about that, about the nightmares and the coffee cups and the story about James standing in the doorway, and about Evan calling him Garrett with careful seriousness, and about the way Cole put extra biscuit on a sleeping boy's plate and didn't want anyone to see. I think so too, she said. He didn't say anything else, but she saw, from the corner of her eye, the faint shift at the corner of his mouth. February arrived with a thaw that lasted 4 days, during which the yard became a lake of mud, and Clara discovered that the ranch house's roof had a weakness above the east corner that let in a slow, steady drip whenever there was snowmelt. She put a bucket under it. Cole got up on the roof with patching material despite her saying the ice up there was going to kill him, and he came back down mud-covered and irritable and said he'd gotten most of it. Most of it, she said. The corner's harder to get to. The corner is exactly the problem. I know that, Clara. She looked at him. He looked back at her. They were standing in the kitchen with mud tracked across the floor she'd swept that morning and the bucket catching slow drips in the corner, and both of them slightly sharper-tongued than the moment warranted. Sorry, he said. I'm sorry, too. She turned back to the counter. I'll get up there tomorrow when it's dried some. You won't, he said with sudden conviction. Excuse me? The pitch on that roof will slide you right off. I've been on roofs before. Not that one. She turned around again. He was still standing in the middle of the room, still muddy, arms crossed, looking at her with an expression that was trying to be stubborn, and was also, she thought, something else. Something that had to do with not wanting her to fall off a roof, which was a specific kind of not wanting that was different from practicality. She recognized the difference. Fine, she said. You'll fix the corner when it's safe to. I said I would. Then we're agreed. A pause. We're agreed, he said. She handed him a cloth for the mud. He took it without comment. The dripping into the bucket continued, patient and rhythmic, and Evan appeared from the back of the house and looked at the mud on the floor and then at both of them. Are you fighting? He said. No, they said at the same time. Evan looked deeply unconvinced. You sound like you're fighting. Go get your boots off, Clara said. You're tracking more mud in. He went, muttering something she chose not to hear clearly. Cole looked at her, and this time the shift at the corner of his mouth was definitive enough to constitute an actual expression. Don't, she said. I didn't say anything. You were going to. I was going to say he's a sharp kid. She turned back to the counter, and the fact that she was smiling was something she managed to keep in profile. He is, she said. The notice of hearing came in the last week of February. Prescott had prepared them for it, but the physical document, delivered by a county rider to the ranch on a cold afternoon, official and formal with its seals and its language, had a different weight than preparation. Clara held it and read it again. Marcus Bennett, in the capacity of surviving male relative, was petitioning for custodial guardianship of Evan Thomas Bennett, minor, on the grounds of the mother's instability of circumstance and the questionable legitimacy of her recent marital arrangement. Questionable legitimacy. She folded the document. Cole was watching her from across the room. She put the paper on the table and pressed her hands flat against it. All right, she said. All right, he said back. It was the same 2 words. They'd said them to each other at the beginning of this, when the thing between them had been nothing but a decision and a shared understanding that the decision was necessary. Now they said them again, and the words meant the same thing and something more, the way the same words can accumulate meaning over time without anyone deciding that they should. She looked at him across the table, this man she'd been married to for 2 months, this man she'd come to in desperation, and who had let her stay and who had, without ceremony or announcement, become someone she relied on in ways she hadn't fully tracked until this moment. "We're going to win," she said. He didn't say, of course, or don't worry, or any of the things people said when they were filling silence with reassurance. He said, "We're going to fight. That's the part we control." That was enough. That was more than enough. Evan found them that evening sitting at the table with papers between them and the lamp pulled close, and he stood in the doorway the way he did when he was reading a room. "Is it the man?" he said. "Marcus?" Clara looked up. "Yes." "Is he going to try to take me away?" She held her son's gaze and answered him the way she'd decided early on that she was going to answer him, not with false comfort, but with truth shaped to what a 6-year-old could carry. "He's going to try," she said, "and we're going to stop him." Evan looked at Cole. "Both of you?" "Both of us," Cole said. The boy stood in the doorway for another moment, processing this with his particular gravity. Then he came into the room, pulled the third chair out from where it lived against the wall, and sat down at the table with them. He didn't ask what the papers said. He didn't ask what was going to happen. He just sat there, in the lamplight, with the two of them, present and solid, a 6-year-old planting his small self in the middle of the fight, as if his being there was a contribution. Maybe it was. Clara reached over and rested her hand on the top of his head, briefly, the way you touch something you're afraid of losing. He leaned into it slightly, then straightened up, trying for the dignity he always wanted to project. Outside, the last of the February light bled out of the sky, and the cold settled hard over the ranch, and inside the lamp held steady, and the papers were spread on the table, and none of them were ready for what was coming. But they were together, which was the only kind of ready that had ever mattered. Prescott came to the ranch the week before the hearing. He rode out on a Tuesday afternoon when the March sky was doing what March skies do in that part of the territory, threatening everything and delivering nothing conclusive. And he sat at the kitchen table with his leather notebook and went through what they would face with the methodical patience of a man who believed in preparation, the way other men believed in luck. "Holt is good," Prescott said. He didn't soften it. "He knows how to work a courtroom, and he knows how to work a judge. He's going to come at 3 things: the speed of the marriage, the circumstances of your arrival here, and the question of Evan's inheritance." "What inheritance?" Clara said. "I told you, Thomas died with debts." "Thomas did, but Prescott has been doing some research." He caught himself, almost smiled at the self-reference. "I have. The Bennett family, the Eastern branch, held a land trust through a company called Harwick Consolidated. The trust had several properties. One of them, a parcel in Greer County, was deeded partially to Thomas Bennett in his father's will, held in contingency pending certain conditions." Clara stared at him. "Thomas never told me. He may not have known the full extent of it. These things get buried in estate documents that nobody reads carefully until someone decides to." Prescott opened his notebook to a page of handwritten figures. "The parcel is worth something. Not a fortune, but not nothing. And because Thomas had a direct heir, Evan, the contingency interest passes to the boy." Cole, who had been standing near the wall with his arms crossed, said, "And if Marcus controls the boy, he controls the trust. Until Evan reaches majority, yes. A guardian has fiduciary authority over an estate in trust." Prescott looked at Clara. "This is what Holt was engaged for. It was never primarily about the child. It was about that parcel." Clara sat very still. She was thinking about Marcus at her kitchen table, the practiced smile, the way his eyes had moved around the room. She was thinking about all the time she'd assumed the worst of Marcus and told herself she was being uncharitable, and how it turned out she hadn't been charitable enough in the other direction. "He knew about the parcel before he came here," she said. "Almost certainly. And he was going to use custody of Evan to get control of it. That's my reading of it." She looked at Cole. He was already looking at her. There was something in his face that was past anger, a cold, settled recognition. "Then we use that," Cole said. Prescott looked at him. "Carefully. If his motive is the property and not the boy, we can prove his motive is the property and not the boy. In theory, In practice, Holt will have prepared Marcus to appear as a man of genuine familial concern. Prescott tapped his pen. We need something more than argument. We need evidence of his actual intent, letters, if any exist, correspondence with Holt prior to Thomas's death, before he would have had any reason to know Evan might need a guardian, which would indicate he'd been watching the situation for a while. How do we get that? Clara said. We ask for it through proper legal request. Holt will fight the disclosure, but the request itself will tell the judge something. Prescott closed his notebook. Here's what I need you both to understand. A judge in a domestic hearing is going to look at that child. He's going to look at his situation, his health, his stability. He's going to look at you both and make a judgment that is only partly legal and mostly human. The legal argument is my job. Your job is to be exactly who you are. Who we are, Clara said. A mother who has kept her son alive through extraordinary difficulty. A man who opened his home when he didn't have to and has been a consistent presence for that boy. Prescott looked at Cole. Witnesses will speak to that. Aldermen performing the ceremony will speak to that. But the judge will also look at you in that room, and he will decide in his gut whether what he's seen is real. The word again, real. After Prescott left, Clara stood at the window watching his horse grow small against the gray sky and felt the weight of the week ahead settle into her shoulders. He's right, she said. About which part? Cole said from behind her. All of it. She turned. I keep thinking, if I'd known about the land trust, if Thomas had told me, I would have had more protection from the beginning, but he didn't, and I didn't know, and there's no use in being angry at a dead man for what he didn't tell me. No, Cole said, there isn't. She stopped, started again. I did everything right. I kept moving, I kept working, I kept him fed and alive, and this man is going to stand up in a court and say it wasn't enough. Cole crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from her, which was about as close as he ever positioned himself deliberately, and looked at her with the full, unguarded attention he normally kept behind several layers of restraint. He can say whatever he wants, Cole said. He doesn't get to decide what's true. She held his gaze for a moment. There were things moving in the back of her chest that she wasn't going to name in this kitchen in the afternoon light, things that had been accumulating for weeks in the specific way that feelings accumulate when you're too busy surviving to examine them directly. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He shook his head slightly. You don't need to thank me. I know I don't need to. I'm doing it anyway. He looked at her for another moment, and then he said quietly, I know. The night before the hearing, Evan couldn't sleep. Clara heard him at around 10 o'clock. The specific sound of a child trying to move quietly and failing, and she found him in the main room sitting in the rocker with his blanket and the wool cap, staring at the fire. Come on, she said. Back to bed. I'm not tired. You're always tired at 10 o'clock. Not tonight. He looked at the fire. Are they going to take me? She sat down on the edge of the hearthstone near him. The fire was low, but still warm. I don't think so, she said. But you don't know. No, I don't know. He considered this. That man, Marcus, he doesn't actually want me, does he? He wants something else. She looked at her son, this 6-year-old with his serious eyes and his habit of seeing things plainly. She thought about lying and decided against it, the same way she always decided against it with him. He wants something that belongs to your papa's family, she said carefully. And he thinks having you is how he gets it. Evan was quiet for a moment. That's a bad reason to want a kid. Yes. Garrett doesn't have a bad reason. She paused. No, he doesn't. He doesn't have any reason, Evan said. I mean, not a reason like something he gets. He pulled the blanket tighter. He just does it. Clara felt something tighten in her throat. Yes, she said. He does. They sat by the fire a while longer. At some point, Evan started to lean, and by the time Cole appeared silently in the doorway of the back hall, he'd heard them, clearly, the way he heard most things in this house. The boy was most of the way asleep in the chair. Cole looked at the boy, then at Clara. She looked back at him. He crossed the room and picked Evan up the way you pick up a sleeping child, careful and certain at once, and carried him back to the small room and put him in the bed and pulled the quilt up. Clara watched from the doorway. He came back out, and they stood for a moment in the main room without speaking. "We should both sleep," he said. "I know." "Clara." She looked at him. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that what's here, this isn't something I'd take back." She understood that for him, this was a speech. She understood what it had cost him to say it. "Neither would I," she said. The county courthouse in Millhaven was a one-story wooden building that tried for authority with its painted trim and the territorial seal above the door, and mostly achieved a dignified adequacy. The hearing was set for 9 in the morning. They arrived at 8:30 in the wagon, Clara and Cole and Evan, Martha and Abe in Martha's trap behind them, and Prescott was already there, standing on the steps with his leather bag and the calm face of a man who'd done this before. Marcus was already inside. They took seats on the left side of the room, which was not much of a room. 2 rows of benches, a judge's table, a small rail dividing the public space from the area where the lawyers stood. Holt was on the right, a tall man with a brown beard and a very good coat, arranging his papers with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he didn't intend to. Clara had seen that kind of confidence before. She did not find it reassuring. The judge was a man named Carveth, who'd ridden over from the county seat specifically for the hearing. He was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, heavy-set, with the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had stopped bothering years ago. He sat down, arranged his papers, looked at both tables, and said they'd begin. Holt went first. He was good. Prescott had said so, and he was right. Holt laid out Marcus's concern for Evan with exactly the right blend of family obligation and apparent warmth, framing Marcus as a man who had discovered, belatedly, the precarious situation of his cousin's widow and orphaned child, and had felt compelled by duty to act. He talked about stability. He talked about resources. He talked about the boy's future in terms that sounded like genuine care, and were, Clara knew, the architecture of a financial argument. And then he talked about the marriage. He called it hasty. He called the timing suggestive. He said that a marriage contracted within weeks of a woman's arrival at a man's property, under circumstances that coincided exactly with a custody dispute, raised questions about its sincerity that the court ought to consider seriously. He did not use the word fraudulent. He didn't need to. Beside her, Cole sat without moving. His hands were flat on his knees. His face was neutral in the way of a man applying effort to keep it that way. Prescott laid out their case steadily. He called Martha first. She described what she'd observed at the ranch, the work Clara did, the way the house had changed, the relationship between Evan and Cole, the meals and the repairs, and the thousand small dailiness of a real household. She spoke without being asked to perform warmth, which made everything she said more credible. Abe was next. He was brief and direct. He'd seen Mrs. Cole. He used the name without prompting, working that property since November. He'd seen Mr. Cole with the boy. He said what he'd observed, and he said he didn't have opinions on things that weren't his business, and sat back down. Then Prescott called Judge Alderman. This was the piece Holt hadn't been prepared for. Clara watched Alderman walk to the front of the room, a compact, gray-haired man with the bearing of someone comfortable with authority, and watched Holt's expression process the appearance with something close to reassessment. Alderman described performing the ceremony. He described the demeanor of both parties. He said, in response to Prescott's question, that he had married a good number of people in his years on the circuit, and that he had, in his experience, a reasonable capacity to distinguish between a couple making a practical arrangement and two people who were, in whatever incomplete and unfinished way, building something together. "Which did you observe?" Prescott asked. "The latter," Alderman said. Holt cross-examined. He pressed on the timing. Alderman acknowledged the timing. He declined to say the timing made the marriage illegitimate. He said people married quickly on the frontier for all kinds of reasons, and that urgency of circumstance did not determine the sincerity of intent. It was a good answer. It was not, Clara thought, going to be enough on its own. Marcus testified next, for Holt. He was polished and sober and exactly as composed as she'd expected. He talked about family obligation. He talked about Evan's future. He talked about the resources he could provide, education, stability, connections. He did not, she noticed, say a single thing about Evan as a person. Not the wool cap, not the serious eyes. not the way he stood in doorways and waited to read a room before entering it. Marcus described a theoretical child and what that theoretical child deserved and said almost nothing about the actual 6-year-old boy sitting 3 feet from Clara with his hands in his lap. When Prescott stood up to cross-examine, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at his notebook, then at Marcus. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "when did you first become aware of the Harwick Consolidated Land Trust?" The room shifted. Holt's head came up. "I'm not certain what that has to do with," Marcus began. "Please answer the question," Judge Carveth said, without looking up from whatever he was writing. Marcus took a beat. "I became aware of it some time ago, as part of understanding my family's holdings." "And when did you first become aware that your cousin Thomas Bennett held a contingency interest in a parcel held by that trust?" It was around the time of his death, I believe." "I have here," Prescott said, opening a folder, "a letter from you to an associate in the county land office, dated 14 months before Thomas Bennett's death, making inquiries about the contingency status of that parcel." He held up the paper. "This letter predates Thomas's illness by more than a year. It predates by 2 years any contact you made with his widow." Holt was on his feet. There was an objection. There was a brief, pointed exchange between the 2 lawyers and the judge, at the end of which Judge Carveth said he would see the letter. Clara did not look at Marcus. She looked at Prescott, who handed the letter to the judge's clerk with the practiced calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment. She had not known about the letter. Prescott had found it in the course of his research, a copy filed in the county land office records, where it had been sitting unremarkably for over a year. He'd told her about it the night before, quietly, in the kitchen after Evan was asleep, and she'd read it and understood what it meant. Marcus had been watching Thomas's land interest long before Thomas died, long before there was any question of a widow or an orphan or a custody arrangement. He'd been watching it because he'd intended at some point to move on it, and Thomas's death and Evan's vulnerable circumstances had simply given him a mechanism. The judge read the letter. He read it twice. His face continued to give nothing away, but he set it down differently than he'd picked it up. When the cross-examination resumed, Prescott asked Marcus, simply and directly, whether his interest in Evan's guardianship was motivated by genuine familial concern or by the financial value of the trust interest that Evan's custody would allow him to control. Marcus said it was the former. Prescott asked him to explain why he had been making inquiries about the land parcel more than a year before his cousin's death. Marcus said he had a general interest in understanding family assets. Prescott asked him to describe one specific thing Evan enjoyed doing. A pause. Longer than it should have been. "He's a young boy," Marcus said. "I haven't had extensive opportunity to—" "You visited Mrs. Cole's home in December," Prescott said. "You spent time in the presence of the child. What does he like to do?" Another pause. "I don't recall specifically." Prescott let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "No further questions," and sat down. Clara felt Cole's hand, briefly, cover hers on the bench between them. Just for a second. Just long enough. Judge Carveth called a recess of 30 minutes. Clara, Cole, and Prescott went to the small anteroom off the main hall, and Prescott said he thought it had gone as well as it could, which was a careful way of saying he didn't know. Martha kept Evan occupied in the hallway with a story about her farm that grew more embellished every time Clara heard it. "Will the letter be enough?" Cole said. "It establishes motive," Prescott said. "Whether the judge weighs motive against Marcus's standing as a relative, that depends on Carveth." He looked at Clara. "You did well, both of you." "I didn't testify," she said. "No, but you were in that room. Carveth has been watching you this whole time." He glanced at Cole. "Both of you." Cole said nothing. He stood with his back against the wall, arms crossed, doing what Clara recognized by now as his version of waiting. Not passive, but contained, everything held inward until there was something useful to do with it. She sat on the bench near the window and looked at her hands and thought about Evan in the hallway, listening to Martha's increasingly improbable story about a rooster and a fence post. And she thought about the drawing on the wall at home, a house and a tree and 2 stick figures, one large and one small. And she thought about James, who had stood in doorways in the dark, and about the way Cole had carried Evan to bed last night with the care of a man who had done that before and had not expected to do it again. She thought about all the things that had happened between arriving at a strange gate in November with nothing left and sitting in this anteroom now with a lawyer and a husband and a fight she hadn't started but was going to finish. She had not planned any of it. That was the truth of it. She had planned exactly nothing beyond the next immediate necessity. And somehow, the accumulation of those immediate necessities had become a life she would choose, if choosing were on offer. The clerk appeared at the door. The judge was ready. Carveth spoke for about 10 minutes. He spoke about the interests of the child. He spoke about the evidence presented regarding the stability of the Cole household. He mentioned, briefly and without extensive elaboration, the letter Prescott had introduced, and said that the court was obligated to consider not only the resources a petitioner could offer, but the motivations underlying the petition. He said that guardianship was not a mechanism for the management of financial assets. He said that the child in question appeared, by all evidence presented, to be settled, cared for, and in the company of people with genuine investment in his welfare. He denied the petition. Clara heard the words and felt them arrive at some delay, the way loud sounds sometimes register a second after they happen. She heard Holt's chair scrape. She heard something from Marcus's direction that wasn't a word but carried the shape of one. She heard Prescott say something quietly at her left elbow. She looked at Cole. He was looking at her. His face was doing the thing it did when something had happened that mattered, and he hadn't yet decided how to carry it. The stillness that was the opposite of blankness, the stillness of a man processing something real. "Okay," she said. It came out barely above a breath. "Yeah," he said. Evan had appeared at the door of the room, Martha's hand on his shoulder, and he was looking at his mother's face, trying to read what had happened. She turned to him, and he must have seen it in her expression, because he crossed the room to her at a run, not graceful, crashing into her with the full, unself-conscious force of a child who has been trying to be grown up all morning and has abruptly stopped trying. She caught him and held him and pressed her face into the top of his head, the wool cap still lopsided above one ear where he'd jammed it, and she held on harder than she meant to. "We won?" he said into her shoulder. "We won," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Can we go home now?" She looked up. Cole was still standing where he'd been, watching the two of them, and something in his face had come open in the way faces sometimes do when they stop needing to be defended. "Yes," Clara said. "Let's go home." Marcus left Millhaven before the end of the week. Prescott heard through the county office that Holt had filed a notice withdrawing representation, which meant Marcus had either run out of options or money or both. Clara received no letter. She didn't expect one. Marcus was a man who moved toward things he could use and away from things he couldn't, and they had made themselves, in the end, unusable for his purposes. She didn't feel triumphant about it exactly. She felt settled. The way you feel when something uncertain resolves, and you realize you'd been holding tension in your body that you'd stopped noticing was there. The drive home from Millhaven took most of an afternoon, the March sky finally delivering on its long threats with a thin, cold rain that turned the road soft and made the horses careful. Evan fell asleep against Clara's shoulder before they'd cleared the edge of town. Cole drove with his hat pulled down against the rain and his coat collar up. And they didn't talk much, but the silence was the easy kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. The ranch appeared as it always did when they came over the low ridge. The timber house, the chimney, the barn, and the windmill and the corral, the horses moving slowly at the fence. It looked like what it was, which was a working place that people lived in, not beautiful in any particular way, but solid and present and real against the gray sky. Cole brought the wagon to a stop near the door. He looked at the house for a moment before he climbed down. "The corner of the roof still needs finishing," he said. Clara almost laughed. "I know. I'll get to it when it dries." "I know you will." She passed the sleeping Evan to him, the transfer careful and practiced between them now, and climbed down herself. She stood in the light rain looking at the house. "Garrett," she said. He looked at her over the boy's head. "Thank you," she said. "For the same reason I said it before, and for other reasons now." He held her gaze. "You don't have to keep thanking me." "I know. I'm going to anyway." Something crossed his face. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that lived next to one, the thing she'd been seeing more of these past months, The gradual reopening of a man who'd closed himself down and was finding, against his expectations, that the world still had things in it worth opening for. "Come inside," he said. "It's raining." She followed him in. Spring came to the ranch the way it always did in that part of the territory. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but in increments so small you almost missed each one individually. A week after the hearing, the mud in the yard began to firm at the edges. Then the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed put out the first pale suggestions of green. Then one morning, Clara opened the kitchen door, and the air had a different quality to it, something that had been stripped out of the winter cold finally returning, a softness at the edges of the chill that told you the worst was over, even if the cold wasn't finished yet. She stood in the doorway drinking her coffee and felt it on her face and thought that she had never in her life been more aware of what it meant for a season to change. The days after the hearing had a different texture than the days before it. She hadn't fully understood until the threat was removed how much of her daily attention had been directed toward it, a kind of background watchfulness that she'd learned to maintain so automatically she'd stopped noticing it was there. Now it was gone, and the space it left was strange at first, a little like the silence after a loud noise, and then it became simply space, room to pay attention to other things. There were plenty of other things. The roof corner Cole had been promising to fix since January finally got fixed on a dry day in early April, Cole up on the pitched shingles with patching material, and Clara standing below with her arms crossed, saying she wasn't worried and clearly worrying, until he came down with mud on his coat and said it was done, and she said, was he sure? And he said he was sure, and they both pretended that exchange hadn't happened. The east pasture needed new fencing, which meant several days of post-setting that left Cole's shoulders wrecked and his temper short in the evenings, a shortness he managed by going quiet rather than sharp, which Clara had come to understand was the best version of him when he was exhausted. She left food on the table and didn't require conversation, and they got through those evenings all right. Evan grew exactly half an inch, which he tracked by standing against the doorframe of the back hall where someone, she suspected Cole, though he didn't say so, had made a small mark in pencil at the boy's head height. Evan found the mark one morning and stood against it and announced the measurement with the gravity of a land surveyor reporting significant findings. "Half an inch since November," he said at breakfast. "That's good," Cole said, without looking up from his coffee. "Is that fast or slow?" "It's normal." "How do you know what's normal?" Cole looked up. "I just do." Evan considered this. "Did you mark someone else before?" The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Clara watched Cole's face process it, not with pain exactly, but with the particular quality of something that had been carried a long time and had become not light, but familiar in its weight. "Yes," Cole said. Evan looked at the mark on the doorframe. "James?" "Yes." A pause. Cole had told Evan about James sometime in February in the simple and direct way he told things, the facts, without embellishment, without asking for a response. Evan had received it the same way, with the serious nod of someone filing important information carefully. "Is it okay that I used the same door frame?" Evan said. Cole looked at him for a moment. Something moved through his expression that Clara didn't try to name. "Yes," Cole said. "It's the same house. It makes sense." Evan nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his eggs. Clara wrapped her hands around her cup and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be less than what had just happened between them. Some things you let sit exactly as they are. Martha came by in April with news and seeds, both of which she dispensed with equal practicality. The news was that Vera Hollis had found something new to occupy her opinions, a disputed boundary line between two farms north of town, and had largely moved on from the question of the Cole marriage's legitimacy. The seeds were for the kitchen garden that Clara had been talking about establishing on the south side of the house, a garden that had been theoretical all winter and was now, with the ground thawing, something that could actually happen. "Vera's not going to apologize," Martha said, accepting coffee and sitting in the chair she'd made her own over the months. "That's not in her nature, but she's also not going to keep at it. She's got no ammunition left, and she knows it." "I don't need an apology," Clara said. "I know you don't. I'm just saying the field's clear." Martha wrapped her hands around the cup. "There are people in town who've come around for what it's worth. Frank Dillard's wife told me last week she thought you'd done a sensible thing, marrying as you did. That's not exactly a warm endorsement, but from Edna Dillard, it's something. Progress, Clara said with dry humor. On the frontier, progress is progress. Martha looked at her steadily. How are you? Actually, Clara thought about it honestly, which was the only way Martha asked things. Tired, she said, but the right kind of tired. The kind that comes from work, not fear. That's a real distinction. I know. I've had plenty of the other kind. I know the difference. Martha nodded. She looked out the window at the yard, at the south side of the house where the garden would go. You're putting down roots, she said. It wasn't a question. Clara followed her gaze. The south wall of the house caught the afternoon light in a way that she'd noticed differently now than she had in November, when she'd been cataloging the house as a stranger, trying to understand what she was in the middle of. Now she knew where the light fell and when, and what it meant for what could grow there. I think I am, she said. The conversation she had been half expecting with Cole happened on a Sunday evening in late April, after Evan was asleep. It didn't begin as a significant conversation. It began as two people sitting near the fire at the end of a working week, Cole with a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside him, Clara with the mending she'd been meaning to get to for 3 days. The fire had burned down to a comfortable low. Outside, the spring night was making its particular sounds. The creek that had finally come back to life after winter, the horses shifting in the barn. I want to talk to you about something, Cole said. She set down the mending. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fire, his elbows on his knees, his hands loose between them. It was the posture of a man working up to something he'd been carrying for a while. I've been thinking about what Prescott said, he said, about the marriage needing to present as genuine. It was genuine, she said. I know. He paused. That's what I want to talk about. She waited. When I said yes to this arrangement, he said, slowly, choosing words with the care of a man who didn't use many of them carelessly. I told you I wasn't looking for what I had before. That's still true. He looked up at her. But I've been thinking that what I said it couldn't become. I said I wasn't sure I wanted that, even if I could have it. I've been thinking about whether that was honest. Was it? At the time. He looked at the fire again. It's different now. Clara held very still. I'm not good at this, he said. I want you to know I know that. I spent 2 years not talking to people, not letting things in. That doesn't disappear. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. But you're already in, you and Evan. That happened without me deciding it, which I think is the only way it could have happened. She thought about November, about the gate and the cold and Evan's burning skin, about the second cup of coffee placed without comment, about all the small moments that had accumulated without her tracking them until she looked up one day and found herself somewhere she hadn't planned to be and didn't want to leave. I know, she said. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. The echo of her own words back at the beginning, deliberate or not. I didn't want to keep carrying it without saying it. She was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside, the creek ran on. Garrett, she said. He looked at her. I've been carrying the same thing, she said, for about 2 months, if I'm being precise. Something in him went still and then loosened, the way a thing under long tension loosens when the pressure finally releases. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They sat there a while longer in the way of two people who have said something important and don't need to fill the space after it. The fire burned down further. The creek ran. At some point, his hand found hers on the arm of the chair, and neither of them moved. It was not romantic in the way that people mean when they use that word lightly. It was something older and harder won than that. The warmth of two people who had been through enough to know what warmth was worth, who had chosen each other not in the flush of feeling, but in the accumulation of early mornings and difficult weeks and small, unremarkable moments that had, without anyone declaring them significant, become the foundation of something real. That was what she would think later when she tried to understand what had happened to her in that year on the frontier. Not that she had found love in the way stories promise you'll find it, sudden and clear and unmistakable, but that she had found it the way you find solid ground after walking uncertain terrain for a long time, step by step, each step only slightly more confident than the last, until you realize one day that you've stopped checking whether the ground will hold. It holds. That's all. It just holds. Summer that year was long and generous, the kind of summer that makes you forget the winters that bracket it. The kitchen garden went in on the south side of the house and produced more tomatoes than the three of them could eat, which meant Clara was putting up jars in August with Martha's help while the kitchen ran with heat, and both women stood at the stove sweating and arguing companionably about the proper amount of salt. Cole appeared in the doorway once, looked at the situation, and retreated to the barn with the expression of a man making a tactically sound decision. The fencing got finished. 3 new cattle were added to the herd, a transaction Cole had been considering since winter, and had discussed with Clara in the matter-of-fact way he'd developed of consulting her on ranch decisions. Not asking permission, but genuinely weighing her perspective, which was a kind of respect she hadn't always been paid and didn't take for granted. Evan learned to ride. This happened incrementally over the course of June on the gray mare that had been in the corral since Clara's arrival. Cole handled the instruction with the same patience he'd applied to the rope coiling lesson months before. Specific corrections, clear expectations, no false praise when the boy made mistakes, and no harshness either. Just the steady repetition of someone who believed that the right information given consistently was the best education available. Evan fell off twice, once due to technique and once due to overconfidence, which Cole said was its own kind of technique problem. By July, Evan could manage the mare around the corral without assistance, and by August he was accompanying Cole on short rides out to check the fence lines, sitting in the saddle with the serious concentration of a child determined to prove something. Clara watched them ride out one evening from the kitchen window, Cole on his big bay and Evan on the gray, side by side, the boy working to match his posture to the man's, and felt something she needed a moment to identify. Not just happiness. Something more layered than that. Something that had to do with the fact that she had come to this place with nothing but the need for her child to survive, and had stayed to watch him thrive, and that the difference between surviving and thriving was, she had learned exactly as vast as it sounded. She turned back to the stove. It was Martha, in September, who asked the question Clara had been half asking herself. They were in the yard in the early evening, Martha's horse tied to the fence, the last of the summer light going gold and long across the grass. Evan was somewhere with Cole. The tomatoes had come in for the last time, and the garden was winding down into its autumn form. "Are you happy?" Martha said. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without apology, expecting an honest answer. Clara looked at the house, at the chimney, at the window where the lamp was already lit because Cole lit it when he came in the evenings, not because anyone had asked him to. "Yes," she said. She said it without qualification or hedging, which was new. She'd spent a long time not being able to say things without conditions attached to them. Martha nodded, as if this confirmed something. "You look it," she said. "You look different than you did in November." "I was different in November. You were held together with wire and stubbornness in November." Martha said it without unkindness. "Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes wire and stubbornness is all there is. But it's not a good permanent state." "No," Clara said. "It isn't. He's different too." Martha tilted her head toward the barn, where Cole's voice could be heard saying something low and instructive, and Evan's voice could be heard responding with the bright confidence of someone who had recently been told he was doing something correctly. "Garrett, he's not the man I remembered from before." "Before what?" "Before you." Martha looked at her. "He was sealed up. Like a jar someone's pressed the lid down on too tight. You could see something inside, but you couldn't get to it." She paused. "He's not sealed now." Clara looked at the barn. She thought about the nightmares and the coffee cups in the dark, about a man who'd told her about his son not as a grief performance, but as a true thing simply stated, about the way he'd said, "I didn't want to keep carrying it," without saying it, with the specific effort of someone who'd been carrying things alone for so long that saying them at all required a kind of courage that didn't look like courage from the outside. "He's working at it," Clara said. "It doesn't come easily to him." "Most things worth having don't," Martha said. In October, exactly 1 year after Clara had turned down the left fork of the road, on the word of a stranger who'd mentioned a ranch and a man who kept to himself, she found out she was carrying a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she said anything, not because she was afraid to say it, but because she needed those 3 days to understand what she felt about it, which was more complicated than she'd expected. She felt, not surprised exactly, but taken off guard in the way you're taken off guard by things that are entirely logical and somehow still feel sudden. She felt the particular vulnerability of being happy and knowing it, which is its own kind of exposure. She told Cole on a Thursday evening. He was at the table with the ranch accounts when she sat down across from him. He looked up and must have read something in her face because he set the papers down. She told him plainly. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb it. The stillness, the processing, the way the information moved through him and began to settle. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." She paused. "Are you?" He looked at her. Something was happening in his face that she didn't try to interpret prematurely, that she let move at its own speed. "Yes," he said. The word came out rough at the edges, like something that had been held for a moment before being released. "Yes." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat there for a while with the lamp between them and the quiet house around them and the fact of the new thing settling into the space of what they'd built. "Evan's going to have questions," she said eventually. "Evan always has questions. These ones might be harder than usual." Cole's mouth did the thing at the corners, slow and small. "He'll be fine," he said. "He's a sharp kid." They told Evan on Saturday morning. He listened with his characteristic gravity, asked 3 precise and logical questions about the mechanics of the situation. Clara fielded those, and then sat thinking for a moment. "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" he said. "We don't know yet," Clara said. "I'd like a girl," Evan said. "Boys are all right, but girls are usually smarter. That's what Martha says." "Martha says a lot of things," Cole said. "She's usually right." "She is usually right," Cole agreed. Evan nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay." He stood up from the table. "Can I go see the horses?" "After breakfast," Clara said. He sat back down, picked up his fork, and returned to his eggs with the air of a person who had received significant news, processed it sensibly, and was ready to move on. Clara looked at Cole over his head. Cole was looking at the boy with an expression that had in it something she could only call tenderness, which was a word she'd have applied to him in November with some difficulty and now applied easily and without question. People surprised you. That was the thing. She'd spent enough of her life learning to manage her expectations of people that she'd perhaps gone too far in the other direction, building in too little room for the possibility that a person could open when you expected them to stay closed, could hold when you expected them to let go, could become, gradually and imperfectly and without ceremony, exactly who you needed them to be. She hadn't known that about Garrett Cole in November. She knew it now. The winter that year was milder than the year before. The snow came in December and was manageable, the road to Millhaven staying passable most of the season, which meant they weren't as cut off as they'd been the previous year. Clara's pregnancy progressed through the cold months with the unremarkable ordinariness that good health makes possible. Some days easier, some harder, Cole learning to read the difference and adjusting accordingly without being asked, which she had come to understand was one of his primary capacities. The ability to observe and respond without requiring everything to be spoken aloud. Evan turned 7 in January. Martha brought cake. Abe brought a carved horse that he'd made himself, which he handed to the boy without comment and received in kind, the two of them nodding at each other in the mutual satisfaction of people who understood that the gesture was the whole thing. Cole had made Evan a new rope, a proper one, correctly weighted, adult-sized. And Evan held it with both hands and tried very hard not to look as moved as he was. "It's a real one," he said. "It is," Cole said. "Like yours. Smaller, but the same make." Evan looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up, and Clara watched him make a decision that moved across his face as clearly as weather across a plain. He stepped forward and put his arms around Cole's middle and pressed his face to the man's chest in the brief, fierce way of a child who has decided something and acts on it all at once before courage fails. Cole went still for a second. Then his arms came around the boy, one large hand on the back of the small head, and he stood there with his eyes closed, and Clara turned to look out the window because some things want privacy, even when there's nobody there to hide from. When she turned back, Evan had already moved on to examining the rope again, and Cole was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has been undone by something small and is quietly reassembling himself. She went and stood beside him and didn't say anything. After a moment, his hand found her shoulder briefly, and then he moved to help clear the table. That was how it was between them. That was the language they'd developed. Not dramatic declarations, not performances of feeling, but the small, persistent gestures of two people who had chosen each other under difficult circumstances and kept on choosing each other in the ordinary ones, which was the harder and more important thing to do. What's up? The baby came in April. She came fast, as second children sometimes do, in the early morning while the light outside was still the pale pre-dawn gray. Martha arrived in time to help, having been summoned the night before when the signs were clear. Cole waited in the main room with Evan, who was supposed to be asleep and was not asleep, the two of them sitting by the fire in the same chairs where Clara and Cole had sat that first terrible night in November and many nights since. Clara heard them talking through the wall, low voices, nothing she could make out, just the sound of the man and the boy being in the same room together in the dark. It was a girl. She weighed what Martha declared a solid and reasonable amount, had her father's dark coloring and the undetermined-looking face of all newborns, and cried with a conviction that suggested she intended to have opinions about things for the foreseeable future. When Cole came in, Martha handed the baby to him with the practical efficiency of a woman who had done this before and didn't make ceremonies where they weren't needed. He took her, which he did with more steadiness than Clara might have expected, though she understood now that he'd done this before, that he knew the weight of a newborn child, that this weight was both entirely new and carried its own particular echo for him. He stood with the baby and looked at her. His face was open in a way that she'd only seen a few times, that same quality of something long closed, no longer needing to be closed. "Hi," he said to the baby. Just that. Quietly, like it was a private introduction. Evan appeared in the doorway with his serious eyes and his 7-year-old gravity. He looked at the baby the way he looked at everything, gathering information before drawing conclusions. "She's small," he said. "Newborns are small," Cole said. "I know that." He came further into the room. "What's her name?" Clara looked at Cole. They'd discussed names but hadn't settled, the way you sometimes don't settle until you see the person who needs the name. "May," Clara said. It came to her as she said it, clear and simple. "May Cole." Cole looked at her. She looked back at him. "May," he said. He looked back down at the baby. "All right." Evan stood at Cole's elbow and looked at his sister with the expression of someone accepting a new long-term responsibility. "She's going to need someone to teach her things," he said. "She is," Cole agreed. "I can do that. I know a lot of things now." "You do," Clara said. Evan nodded, satisfied. He reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand, which reflexively closed around it, and his face did something complicated and wonderful that Clara was grateful to witness. The practiced dignity dropped away completely for just a second, replaced by something unguarded and purely young, the face of a boy who had been trying to be more than he was for a long time and was finally, in this moment, just 7 and surprised and completely unprepared for how it felt to have someone hold on to him. There's something that takes years to understand about a life, which is that you can't know what you're building while you're building it. You think you can. You make plans, you set intentions, you imagine a future with a certain shape and you work toward it, and then something happens. A disease takes a husband, a farm gets sold, a fever rises in a child on a November road, and the shape you'd imagined is gone, and you're standing in something you didn't plan, building something you can't yet see. What Clara had learned in the year that had passed since she turned down a left fork on a stranger's suggestion and walked through a gate she had no reason to expect would open was that you could build something real from the pieces that remained after what you'd imagined was gone. Not a replacement for what you'd lost. Not a consolation. Something new, made from the specific materials of who you actually were and who you'd actually found and what you'd actually chosen to do when the choice was before you. She had chosen to keep walking, She had chosen honesty over pride when she asked for help she couldn't repay. She had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier, and to work when she was allowed to be still, and to speak when speaking was hard, and to wait when waiting was what was needed. She had chosen, in the end, to believe that the incomplete and imperfect thing she'd found was not a lesser version of what she'd been reaching for, but simply a truer one. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not that things worked out, not that the brave were rewarded and the persistent were vindicated, though in this case both happened to be true. The lesson was something quieter and more durable than that you only understood what you had been building after you'd had the chance to stand in it and look around. She stood in it now. The ranch on a spring morning, the year following everything that had happened. The kitchen garden going back in on the south side of the house, Evan on his knees in the dirt with entirely more enthusiasm than precision, Cole on the far side of the yard working on something with a fence post and a focus that suggested the fence post was being difficult. May asleep in the basket on the porch, wrapped in the quilt that had been on Cole's bed that first night, the handmade one, which Clara had repaired and washed and kept because it was too good to stop using. She stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at all of it, the yard and the garden and the horses and the man and the boy and the sleeping baby, and felt the particular quality of a morning that is ordinary on the surface and extraordinary underneath, the kind of morning that is made of all the mornings that preceded it. Cole looked up from the fence post. He looked at her across the yard. She lifted her coffee cup slightly, not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement. He nodded once, in the way he had, that specific nod that was the compressed form of more than he was going to say out loud. She understood it perfectly. She'd learned his language over the winter, the same way she'd learned the ranch, incrementally, through repetition and attention, through choosing every day to pay attention to what was actually there rather than what she'd expected to find. He was not a simple man to know. He had difficulty with things that came easily to other people. He had a long memory for loss and a shorter one for his own worth, which was something she was still working on, gently, over time. The way you work on things that require patience and can't be rushed. He was learning too. She could see it in the way he spoke more than he had in November. The way he stayed in rooms instead of finding reasons to leave them, the way he'd started, in small increments, to let people pass the perimeter he'd maintained for 2 years. Martha, Abe, the few neighbors who'd come around, Evan, thoroughly and completely. May, with the instant, ungovernable surrender of a man who had no defense against an infant who had decided she liked him. And her. That was still the one she turned over sometimes, not with doubt, but with a kind of wondering. The improbability of it, the specificity of it, the way it had assembled itself not from anything either of them had designed, but from the actual material of who they were, under pressure, over time, in this particular place. She had not been looking for him. He had not been looking for her. They had found each other across a gate on a November road and had built something neither of them had imagined, and it was real, and it was theirs. Whatever you called it, love, belonging, home, it was the kind that was made rather than discovered, the kind that bore the marks of its own construction, imperfect and unlovely in places, solid in the ways that mattered. She went back inside. She put her cup on the counter. Through the window, she could see Evan had given up on careful planting and was now simply pressing seeds into the earth with the flat of his palm in the manner of someone who had decided that enthusiasm was as good as technique. Someday, he'd know that wasn't true. He had time to learn. She started breakfast. The coffee went on. The skillet heated. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning moved through the house that 2 people had built, and that now held 4 lives. And the spring light came through the east window in the long stripe she knew now by heart. And outside, the baby began to make the small sounds that preceded waking. And from the yard, she heard Cole's voice saying something to Evan, and Evan's voice responding, and then both of them laughing at something, which was its own kind of music. The specific and unrepeatable sound of this particular morning in this particular life. She stood at the stove and listened to it and let it be enough, because it was more than enough. It was everything. And that was the last thing she'd had to learn, which was also the first thing, which was maybe the only thing, that what you have when you have looked at it honestly and chosen it truly is exactly sufficient. Not perfect, not what you planned, but yours. Entirely and completely, and real.